Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. My guest today is Susan Stokes. Susan is the Tiffany and Margaret Blake Distinguished Service Professor in the Political Science Department of the University of Chicago and also Faculty Director of the Chicago Center on Democracy. She's an author as well. Her latest book, which she co-authored, is titled Why Bother? Rethinking Participation in Elections and Protests. And her recent article in the winter 2020 edition of the Wilson Quarterly is titled Why Protest? Susan, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, John. Nice to be here.
Great to have you. So let me begin with your titles. Were you able to answer that question? Why do people protest?
I think we did. I think at least in a sort of general social science sense, what we focus on in the book is of kind of interplay between. So think about the protests going on now in the United States. Many people are very concerned with racism and inequality and police abuses, and they're out on the streets and they're protesting and they're doing things that take a lot of time and a lot of effort and can bring on dangers to themselves. But they know that if they stop to think, they may well think their own individual participation isn't going to bring about an end to racism or inequality or police abuse. And so there's got to be something other than a kind of rational, we're going to get this done. If I go out and accept all these risks, I'll get it done. I'll end the racism, achieve the goal that I'm interested in. So what we are interested in is the kind of interplay between what we call the costs of participation and the costs of abstention. So the costs of participation, I think, are pretty vivid to people right now. There are dangers involved in going out into public places and being crowded around other people at the moment. There are dangers of running into police officers or very angry protesters. Those things, not to mention the more mundane potential costs of finding your way to a protest and spending the time that you might otherwise be doing something else. So there clearly are costs of participation, but we think that those are counterbalanced often by what we call costs of abstention. And costs of abstention are a bit more psychological or emotional, but we think they're still very, very real, even if they are kind of more at a sort of psychological level. And what we mean by costs of abstention is a kind of a friction, a kind of inner tension that develops if you care a lot about a subject, an injustice, a state of the world, and other people are doing something about it, and you are kind of on the brink of doing it or doing something or not doing something, and that kind of sense of it might be kind of a guilt or just a kind of inner disequilibrium can be enough to spur people even to kind of ignore the cost of participation or the risks involved and go out on the streets.
So when you've sorted through the motivation, then the question becomes what works in terms of creating real change and what doesn't work. What are your thoughts on that? You hear people say things like, well, I support the cause, but I don't like the looting. And they try to parse it out and pick and choose what works and what doesn't work. Are they onto anything? Or is there any pattern of the type of protest that is generally more successful than the other?
They absolutely are onto something. And it's something that activists and protest leaders are very well aware of. And that is that there's a kind of importance of the attribution of fault when things get violent. So violence. So my colleague, a long-term student of social movements, a person named Dennis Chong at USC, wrote a wonderful book a number of years ago about the U.S. civil rights movement, in which he modeled the kind of interaction of protesters and local sheriff's departments in the South as a kind of public relations game, where the side that was the object of attacks, including physical attacks from the other, was the side that would elicit support from bystanders and from the larger public. The side that was aggressing would lose support from the public. So it was very important in the sort of Bull Connor era that television broadcast images of African American protesters being attacked by dogs and by police officers, and that was then broadcast into the living rooms of people in the north and other parts of the country, and it elicited a real change of attitude and a high degree of support for civil rights among kind of previously probably fairly unaware folks in other parts of the country outside of the South. And if, on the other hand, if the sort of the trope of the kind of looting protester, the lawless protester, the opportunistic person who takes advantage of a movement to get out and break windows and go into stores, that can be very disabling for in terms of generating support from a larger public.
How long does it take for this to sort out, or does it happen in real time? When you were talking about the Bull Connor paradigm, I think of President Trump's decision to clear Lafayette Square and the streets around the White House that did not seem to gain him much support. But then you also saw the pictures of people looting in Los Angeles that same night, and that creates this cognitive dissonance. How long does it take for this to sort out if people are seeing two contradictory actions?
No, it's a complicated process, and a really important part of it is sort of the narrative that gets built around it. And in our country, it will be no surprise that there are many narratives, or at least two narratives that are being built around this. And it does seem at the moment, at this particular point in time, as though I think two things have happened. One is that there's been a kind of a success of protest organizers in exerting some greater control over the protests. So a big part of their job is to make sure that the looting or the kind of dissolution of social fabric kind of side of things isn't what's prominent and isn't what people see on the news or on their social media feeds as much as peaceful protesters. Maybe peaceful protesters having to deal with tear gas, and that's the sort of that's the story that is helpful. Now, you ask how long does this take to sort out? It's really very fast how things have moved. I think there was a moment at the beginning of the protests when there was a lot of kind of difficulty of the protest organizers to control that kind of element, which, by the way, I think is honestly, it is, obviously there's sort of opportunism and some people just being downright selfish. On the other hand, it's kind of a dissolution of the social fabric that's not surprising given the levels of anger and frustration in many communities, in African American communities and other Black and Brown communities. So it can be a very quick kind of shift of what's the public perception. On this one, I think the White House probably, the strategists there are probably kicking themselves now because that one didn't. So what we got there was the juxtaposition of very heavy-handed police tactics being used to make way for what was clearly a pretty constructed sort of artificial photo op.
When you look out at the images on the screens or out in the streets of Chicago or wherever, do you see this as a symptom of democracy in action or democracy in crisis?
I'm a irritatingly optimistic person, so I'd love to say it was.
No, we like that. That's a nice change of pace.
I would love to say democracy in process, and I do think that there are some really exciting things that can come from I think we're all, those of us who are not experts and those of us who, don't suffer from the kinds of abuses that other folks do, are on a very steep learning curve. And I've sure learned a lot about possible police reforms and what the reform agenda is in just the last week or 10 days. So I think that there are some exciting things there. On the other hand, I have to say, I am very fearful that something else will happen. I mean, the agenda we have, some of the things that are on the agenda can be done, with the stroke of a pen by legislators, by city councilors, by mayors, by chiefs of police, by state legislatures, and by the National Congress. But some of the things that we need to do are really long, difficult processes. And I think we need to do the things that can be done quickly so that when, unfortunately, the next abuse is caught on camera, it doesn't feel like we're just starting over again or that nothing is being done.
You wrote social movements are well suited to put brakes on bad policy, but unlikely to usher new alternatives or policy coalitions. Isn't that what you're talking about right now?
Well, it's interesting to see the kind of interconnections of people on the streets and people who are longtime activists who have a lot of expertise in these areas, and then the kind of more wonky communities that I'm sure you're very familiar with there in Washington, who aren't activists particularly, who are sort of more policy people or more legislative related people, and I think I see them working together fairly closely at this stage. I think it's helpful that this comes not out of the blue, but after several years, at least since Ferguson, of cycles of terrible abuses being caught on camera or being learned about in some way, usually because we get images and videos of them, and protests. And then some moments, I happened to be living in New York in the first sort of wave of Black Lives Matter, and I remember that there were two police officers who were killed in their car by someone who wasn't really involved in the movement, and that really took the wind out of the movement for a period. But back to your question, there are certain, there's divisions of labor, and there are people who are going to be good at being out there and bravely, and hopefully carefully, safely, continuing patiently to protest and to make the message, to yell in slogans on the streets. And then there are all kinds of people around them who are learning from them, but who also have policy expertise and political know-how, because it's going to take tremendous political skill and wiliness to work around some of the obstacles to reform at the moment.
It may be too early to ask you this, but because this is such a new moment in history. But when you look at historical precedents and some of the examples from the past that you looked at in your book and in other research, is there some sense that this is different in the US, that there may be some tipping point having been reached, and that is there a historic precedent that this can be compared to where real change occurred in the aftermath?
I think so. I go back to the civil rights movement and to those images that we were talking about before of the, police attack dogs and so on, that really shocked and really changed some of the dynamics and were part of the backdrop to the civil rights legislation, Voting Rights Act, and so on in the Johnson administration. Obviously, there are all kinds of other factors, and it was a different time. But I do think that what happened to George Floyd was so appalling and so clearly unjustified and just shameful that it's difficult for people, even who have some resistance to seeing the police as an abuse of force, or to being to the kind of narrative of that we were talking about earlier. Even they, it's hard to see that and not think that something really big has to change. Furthermore, give the protesters and the activists the credit they're due. There's been an increasingly disciplined set of protests here in Chicago. We had a lot of kind of disturbances early on, and it's been much more disciplined, but still very intense. Lots of people still getting out there. The other thing that's just amazing about the current moment, if I can go back, our Wilson Quarterly article, we talked about the 2010s as sort of the decade of protest, and you think about the Arab Spring and the Occupy movement right through the Gezi Park in Turkey, and just a tremendous kind of Brazil, crescendo of movements. And then you get to 2019, and it just seemed to, we call it the year of the protest. And then, this dramatic narrative where all of a sudden 2020, and nobody's going out anywhere, these vital, dynamic, enormous protests are just overnight closed down.
Is that because of the pandemic?
Because of the pandemic.
Because of the pandemic.
What
do you think happens to that momentum? Will it resume?
So this is what's interesting. I thought the story was year of the decade of the protest, year of the protest, pandemic, and it all closes down. Well, look at what's just happened. Mm-hmm. So if people get angry enough and have enough of a sense of urgency around the need for change, they will, those costs of abstention just can even override even very high costs of participation, because the costs of participation now are very high. And of course, everyone's worried what happens next.
So you mentioned the horror of watching a man killed on camera for 8 minutes and 46 seconds that has been felt around the world. Which leads me to a question about when you look at this historically and try to chart how things are changing, the impact of social media, mobile devices, my phone, that someone was able to record that moment in a way that 20 years ago probably couldn't have happened. Is that a game changer?
It's been a game changer, and I think you're absolutely right. So that I think is a big part of the explanation for why the 2010s have been the year of the protest. So think again about this idea of cost of abstention. What is it that makes you feel angry and then guilty? It's seeing something terrible happen, seeing it on your social media feed, seeing a video, seeing a photo. And that's due to a technological change. That's the digital age and the impact the digital age has had in mobilizing people. So what, the unfortunate way to look at it is, before now, lots of terrible things happened that we didn't see, and we didn't get riled up because we didn't know. Those of us, especially outside of the communities that typically suffer these kinds of abuses. So it is a game changer. Now, of course, governments find ways to, especially in the more authoritarian countries, you see governments fairly quickly pivoting to figuring out ways to try to have their own, to use these same kind of digital devices, cameras, and social media to stamp down on protests, to increase the cost of participation, or to confuse people about what's going on. So the technology in itself can have ambiguous effects, but up until now, we think it's really very strongly gone in the direction of being a mobilizing force.
Before the COVID-19 pandemic, we were in the midst of a disinformation pandemic, and that certainly hasn't slowed down either. I have a final question that I want to ask you about, Susan, before we end our discussion today. And it's about how protesting relates to voting. As we look ahead, this is a presidential election year in the United States. The Senate is up for grabs potentially. How do protests relate to voting? Is there a one-to-one relationship? Are the people that we see in the streets now going to be more motivated to show up at the polls?
Well, it's an interesting question. It's actually something that my co-author Erdem Aytaç and I looked at closely. You may remember during the women's marches in January 2017, President Trump tweeted something about, all those people protesting, where were they? Why didn't they vote? So we thought, okay, we took on the challenge. Okay, are these people is protesting a kind of a substitute for voting? And the quick answer is no, it is not. As you might imagine, people who are willing to take accept burdens, these costs to go out and go into the streets and rally are quite capable of taking on the much lesser cost of going to the voting booth. Now, the one caveat in that is that protesting is the one form of political participation where younger people are more likely to do it than older folks. And it's also
less likely to vote.
That younger people everywhere, this is not just an American phenomenon, in every country, younger people are less likely to vote. Now, we've seen young people turning out in relatively high rates in the United States in recent elections. So yes, on average, the protesters may be turning out a little less than voters, but just because they're young. And those young protesters, I think, are going to be turning out in very large numbers, as will the old fogies like me who make it to the protests.
Well, Susan Stokes, thank you. I'm glad we have old fogies like you to provide some context for us and to help us understand what's happening in this dramatic moment, not just, I think, in U.S. history, but in global history. Thanks for joining us, Susan.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
And thanks to you who have watched and listened to this episode of Wilson Center Now. I hope that you found it as enlightening as I did, and that you'll join us again soon for another episode. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.